Okay, welcome everybody. This is another one of our special simultaneous meetings between the language sciences colloquia and the Maya Living Legacy lecture series. Before I introduce today's speaker, I just wanted to thank the sponsoring units who've made this talk series possible. In addition to language sciences, of course, we also would like to thank LASIS, the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, the Department of Education Policy Studies, Science and Technology Studies, STS, the Department of Plant and Agrosystem Sciences, Agroecology, as well as the Center for Culture, History, and Environment. So with that, it's a real honor to introduce today's speaker, Sergio Romero. Sergio is an associate professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at the University of Texas at Austin. He is probably the leading scholar in Maya sociolinguistics, and he's worked in a number of important areas that lie at the intersection between linguistics, anthropology, and the history of the indigenous peoples of Mesoamerica, focusing mainly on the Maya and Nahua. His research has been funded by the NEH, and he's won numerous fellowships to carry out a lot of his important projects. He's published widely on topics such as language change and variation, new dialect formation, sociolinguistic variation, language ideologies, language and identity in within many communities of speakers of different Mayan languages. We will no doubt learn a lot about some of these topics in today's presentation, which is entitled Language Standardization and Colonialism in Guatemala. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Sergio. Thanks so much for doing this, Sergio. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Grant. I am really honored to be able to be here and to talk to you virtually, share with you some thoughts about things that I've been thinking about in the last few years. Maybe before I start, I should say a couple of things about myself and my work. I was born and raised in Guatemala. I'm not indigenous. I began to work with Mayan languages when I was about 21, when I was in college. I was an anthropology major, and like many Guatemalans of my generation, anthropology became a natural space for political engagement. The reason why I chose anthropology was because I wanted to be active in revolutionary change. When I was in college, there was a time, the few years before the signing of the peace accords that ended the civil war in Guatemala. So it was a time in which scholarship, intellectual activity, and politics were intimately intertwined. There was a time in which, the Maya were also emerging as a political subject. And not only that, because they've always been politically active, but they were now, presenting themselves or claiming for themselves the identity of Maya, which, as you know, is really a category that was developed by Western scholars. In the very beginning, Maya referenced, the Yucatec Maya of Yucatan. It was appropriated first by archaeologists and linguists who realized that Mayan languages were genetically related. So the term was actually taken, from Western scholarship and appropriated by the Maya themselves to reference their own group, their, this emerging politically active pan-ethnicity. So obviously, language was actually quite exciting at the time. That was the beginning of standardization, which is what I'm going to talk about today. And I'm going to share with you some thoughts about the development, the historical development of standardization projects in Guatemala since the middle of the 1980s to the present. And what I'm going to argue is that language revitalization is intrinsically political. It has very strong political connotations, although often the way we talk about it is as if it were simply a technical exercise that can be implemented just by choosing the right methods, the right projects, the right texts, or the right dosifications of indigenous languages, for example, in whatever the dominant language is. I think there is a very strong political element that's been, I wouldn't say neglected, it's been backgrounded as a sort of tactical decision by the Maya movement not to go, head to head with the powers that be in the context of the signing of the peace accords. When, basically speaking your mind or criticizing certain people could still, be dangerous for you. So, of course, the situation has changed. Now there isn't as much political repression as there used to be. We'll talk about that in a minute. So that's really where my interest in Maya revitalization and Maya standardization actually comes from. And in my career, this has not been, one of the, I've written about it. It's something I've always been thinking about. And I'm actually currently engaged in work with a group of Maya intellectuals who are really critiquing the way the Academy of Mayan Languages does its work. So this is another example of the political nature of revitalization projects. So let me start sharing my screen with you. Okay, the first thing, is that when we think about power and the nation state, language is definitely a part of it. I think we can think of modernity as a time in which political entities basically gravitate or represent themselves in terms of a certain language that acts as an emblem. There are all sorts of, discourses or all sorts of political ideologies behind this connection between speaking practices, between languaging, as it's called today, and various nationalist projects and anti-colonial struggles. There are the typical examples that you all are familiar with. I was thinking about German, Hochdeutsch is the standard variety of the language. German is it's a very diverse language. There's a lot of local variation. And in many speakers, in addition to the local variety that they speak semi-natively or natively, depending on the circumstances, they also speak Hochdeutsch. But of course, Hochdeutsch is learned in school. Although, of course, it's also used in everyday life. So actually, I spent a few years in Germany, before the pandemic. So I'm kind of still excited about the ways in which the sociolinguistics of Germany work out today. Um, this contrasts, for example, with the case of Irish, where the Irish language is the emblematic language of the Republic of Ireland, to the neglect of Irish English, which is also highly emblematic and highly exclusive and highly, representative of, Irish literature, for example. So some of the best known works of Irish literature have actually been written in Irish English as opposed to the Irish language. In other situations, the conditions are quite different. And I'm thinking about Guarani, for example, which is, I would say, perhaps the only indigenous language spoken in Latin America that's become a national language. So it isn't an ethnic language spoken by members of this particular Guarani ethnic group, but also by Paraguayans, by virtue of being citizens of the state of Paraguay. So this is an interesting, case where you may not necessarily be indigenous, but you speak Guarani because you're Paraguayan. So it is a stage, I guess, of political legitimation that no other languages of Latin America, indigenous languages, have actually reached. In the history of indigenous languages, we've had cases like Nahuatl, for example, or Quechua, which have been, lenguas generales, or contact languages appropriated by the Spanish themselves. They've been used, for evangelization and for various administrative purposes. So these languages have a special sociolinguistic status. And this is not surprising that some of them have a fantastic literature, going back all the way to the 16th century. I mean, literature using, the alphabet. So these were actually colonial languages, arguably. They were indigenous languages that the colonial powers actually appropriated for their own purposes. So we can see here the various forms in which the articulations between, power, colonial power, and indigenous languages can actually be. In many cases, there is no connection. There are hundreds of languages that were never in any way appropriated by the Spanish or the Portuguese. There were communities, ethnic groups that chose to have as little contact as possible. And therefore, they were never really used for evangelization purposes. There were forms of discourse in those languages that were never, they cannot be traced to some sort of ancestral Spanish language, or a Portuguese language, antecedent. I'm thinking about pastoral registers. Those of you who speak Mayan languages know that there's a lot of Spanish loanwords in Mayan, although sometimes the semantics and even the pragmatics are not quite like in Spanish. So there's definitely a certain nativization of of even Spanish and Portuguese when they're actually borrowed by indigenous languages. But anyway, not only is it the case that language and colonial powers and nationalist powers have this connection, but they often have this very powerful emblematic aspect. And I'm thinking about Hebrew, for example. It's interesting that a language like Yiddish, which is also a language associated with the Ashkenazi Jews, actually went extinct in the state of Israel under the pressure of Hebrew, which became the official language, the language that all Israelis actually chose for themselves to the detriment of other Jewish languages, such as Ladino, for example, or Yiddish. Catalan, for example, is also emblematic of Catalan society. And there are many Catalanistas who speak, Spanish in everyday life, but the language that they identify with as a sort of expression of their own political and nationalist leanings is Catalan. The same is true about Basque. So these are languages also that are highly emblematic and that now have, many more speakers than, they had in recent history. I'm sure that Basque, Catalan, and Hebrew have never had as many speakers as they have today. And some of them, have no direct, I would say, ethnic connection with any of these groups. I've seen the children of African migrants in Loyola in the Basque Country, for example, speak Basque with their friends, playing in the square before the church. So we see here how these languages manifest a certain national identification beyond specific ethnic identification. This can be also the case with specific language varieties, with like American English and, British English, same language, but each variety has very strong, cultural and national connotations. Now, for this very reason, very often the political rise of specific ethnic and national groups entails the rise of a certain language. And particularly, a language is often threatened. It's often in danger of extinction. There are fewer speakers, the children are not learning the language, and the spaces of institutional, economic, and educational prestige and power are often closed to these indigenous languages. So for that reason, it is often the case that even sometimes activists who don't speak these languages very well often argue that for them, language revitalization is strategic. It is an integral, unavoidable aspect of their own national project. So in the case of Guatemala, with the rise of the Maya as a group, naturally, language was actually a central demand, the recognition of language, Mayan languages, and their inclusion in spaces from which they had been excluded until now. So the question I'm going to ask is, how do we measure the success of a revitalization program, such as the one that was implemented in Guatemala, starting in the middle of the 1980s, as I was describing in the beginning? First, I would say you need to look at institutional change, the extent to which institutional spaces are opening to these new languages. Are they being used in the courts? Are they being used at the university? Are they being used by the President of the Republic? Are they being used in the church? Are they being used in TV, in the radio? Are they being used in educational materials? Are there artists who publish materials in Mayan languages? The second aspect is the role of the revitalized language as a defining element of citizenship. That is, to what extent does a citizen of the state of Guatemala needs to learn a Mayan language? Is it a requisite that comes out of a certain set of personal communal convictions or practices, or is it a requisite imposed by the state? And the third criterion is, I would say, number of speakers. Is number of speakers increasing in number? Is the language being transmitted? Are children learning the language? And what specific spaces are being, or in what specific spaces is the language being transmitted or used in everyday life? So the answer to these questions in the case of Mayan languages is actually pretty mixed. So there's been some institutional change, definitely. Now you have, the requisite that all Maya citizens have the right to have translators in Guatemalan courts. There is a very good, staff of translators in Guatemala, active in Guatemalan institutions. They're excellent. I've actually had a chance to work with them, and they're actually really good. Second, that's excellent. But what about there's also Mayan languages also in education. There is a bilingual education program, not of very high quality, I have to say. There are no Mayan languages at the university. Mayan languages are not required to work with the state. NGOs, for example, often require fluency in a particular Mayan language from the staff. And it is also a plus if you're applying for a teaching position. But there is no sense in which Mayan languages are required. And there are very few fields in which competence in the Mayan language actually constitutes a plus in terms of job opportunities. Mayan languages are not co-official, so the state is not under the obligation of producing materials, any kind of official materials in Mayan languages, and services are not necessarily provided in Mayan languages in places where the majority of the population speaks a Mayan language. Mayan languages are not required of Guatemalan citizens who are not Maya. There have been a few changes recently, and in the central part of Guatemala, for example, now public schools, not private schools, public schools are required to teach, Cachiquel in the area around Guatemala City. But those classes are not serious. So I've got a cousin who works as a grade school teacher, and she's being required to teach Cachiquel, a language that she doesn't speak. She's bought a couple of manuals, and she basically just makes children, write, their students write, copy various Cachiquel phrases and words that she doesn't pronounce well because she doesn't speak Cachiquel. So as you can see, it's really not a serious effort. It's really just paying lip service to the terms of the PISA course, but not really engaging in any kind of substantial change. Number of speakers. Yes, the number of speakers has increased because the Guatemalan population has increased. And in many Maya communities, Mayan languages continue to be spoken. They're definitely the primary languages of, a huge sector of the population. There are still, many monolingual speakers, especially in some areas such as the Kekchi area. There is at least, 30% of the population that's basically monolingual. There are other areas where, bilingualism is quite common, but the primary language is the Mayan language, locally spoken. And there are also many cases in which you have populations that speak two Mayan languages. There are biethnic areas in Guatemala where you have Quiche and Ahuacatec speakers, for example. In the areas where I've done field work in the Ixil country, for example, there are many Quiche, and they speak, when they communicate with the Ixil, they do so in Ixil, not in Spanish, which they may know. So definitely the Spanish language is a different status. It is not a community language. The community language is either Quiche or Ixil. We won't have time to talk about the dynamics of Quiche and Ixil because there are some really interesting processes going on there now. But what we see is really a mixed bag of successes and, I wouldn't say failures, but at least limitations. Now, when we talk about Mayan languages, we definitely have to think about colonialism. Colonialism is really not just it doesn't just reference, power relations, but it also references an almost material, series of conditions that really restrains and constrains the use, the transmission, and the prestige of Mayan languages. So against the background of colonialism, Guatemala is the cradle of Mayan languages. There are 23 officially recognized Mayan languages, but Spanish is still the sole national language. There were, up until about 20 years ago, Xincan languages as well. And Garifuna is spoken as well, which is not a Wakan language, with a very unique history. It's a very different kind of indigeneity compared to that of the Maya. And Mayan languages, even though they're widely spoken, they're still excluded from government, academia, business, etc. They do have emblematic uses, and the government has definitely co-opted Mayan languages to some extent. Even the very institutions that have been created to promote Mayan languages, such as the Academy of Mayan Languages, have been used by the government, by the Guatemalan state, as a way to justify, as a way to present itself as being inclusive, even though the economy of the nation, the economy, the social structure, the educational opportunities for children, for Maya children, and basically the living conditions of the Maya continue to be extremely poor. In the last 20 years, we've had a succession of extremely corrupt governments, and really the development figures that had shown improvement after the signing of the peace accords have actually been pushed back. So even though there's no political repression, the political and economic situation of the country is pretty calamitous. Now, as a result, Mayan languages continue to be local languages, family languages that coexist with Spanish, and they continue to be stigmatized, even though they also have a certain level of prestige. There's no doubt that in Guatemala, the Maya are a very emblematic element of the nation. So Guatemalans, even those who are definitely not indigenous and who may actually engage in racist or at least discriminatory practices, do show some appreciation for Mayan languages, at least as tokens of a Guatemalan identity. As you see on this map, the entire territory of Guatemala is covered by Mayan languages. Even in areas where the Maya are not the majority, there are lots of Maya migrants. So markets in Guatemala City, tiendas in Guatemala City, the corner stores in Guatemala City are mostly run by Quiche from Santa Maria Chiquimula. The tortillerias, where you get your tortillas, because Guatemalans don't like to buy their tortillas in the supermarket. They like freshly made tortillas made by hand that you can purchase at various tortillerias. There's at least 2-3 tortillerias per block in Guatemala City, for example. So those tend to be mostly women, young women from Quiche-speaking areas. So the presence of Mayan languages is widespread in Guatemala. In fact, I've always argued that Guatemalans are, in some sense, multilingual. That is, they live in a society in which awareness of multiple languages is necessary for you to have a certain communicational competence. You may not speak Mayan language, but you know what they sound like. And you know the specific, registers of Spanish that you use when you perform a certain persona, when you're telling certain jokes. And those are very, very emblematic of Guatemalans. Those are communicational practices that are very Guatemalteco, very Guatemalan. And for that, you need to have that knowledge of Mayan languages in the background. There are also, many areas where people, where Latinos, that's non-indigenous Guatemalans, have certain fluency in the local language. In the Quechua area, for example, older men and women in areas such as Tecpan, Comalapa, for example, they have some passive knowledge of Mayan languages, and that passive knowledge is useful for them. I know people who claim not to speak Axiquel, for example, but I know they speak Axiquel because I've heard them speak it in the market. So this is actually, again, an important aspect of colonialism as a sort of a set of relations that, constrains the ways in which not only Mayan languages are spoken, but even the ways in which speakers of Mayan languages represent themselves, especially those who are not indigenous. There is definitely a sense in which speaking a Mayan language, unless you're indigenous, is really you're really doing something that you shouldn't do. It is strange, to say the least, and it's really it baffles people on both sides of the equation. And that is basically a result of colonialism. There are exceptions to this. The Quechua area, again, the contact language in the Verapaces is Quechua, and therefore, it is quite common for Latinos and American priests, Congolese priests, Peruvian NGO workers, German NGO workers, Australian priests to speak Quechua. It's really the contact language. Many Pocom speak Quechua as a second language. So even within this small space, when we think about, and this is actually important in terms of implementing revitalization policies, not all Mayan languages are equal. They're equal in dignity, of course. They're equal in value. But in terms of the actual use, in terms of the ways in which they articulate with other local languages, there's a lot of variation. So that, I argue, needs to be taken into consideration when implementing, revitalization policies in Mayan languages. Another issue with Mayan languages is the great regional diversity, in terms of phonology, vocabulary, syntax, and to some extent morphology, word structure. Mayan languages are very diverse. So you can hear things like, "Achikenabun" in Tecpan. What are you doing? And you can hear things like, "Hasne'en" in Comalapa, and so on and so forth. So there are actually meaning the same thing. So there are actually phonological differences. There are also differences in lexicon, and sometimes even There are some syntactic structures that, you find only in certain places. In Quiche, for example, Santa Maria Chiquimula has negative concord, things like what you hear in some dialects of Southern English. I don't tell nothing to no one. So you have three, negation markers, three negators, but there's only one logical negation. You have something similar in Santa Maria Chiquimula Quiche, only that variety. The rest of them don't have this interesting, syntactic innovation. So these are just random examples that show that there's really a lot of variation within Mayan. And also when we go into styles and regional identities, that regional variation is very important. In most Mayan languages, when you say my language is Cachapal, that means our language, Cuyol in Ixil. And often the terms, most of the glottonyms, most of the names of Mayan languages that we use are actually of colonial origin. They were actually imposed by the Spanish. There are only a few that we know for sure were actually used before the Spanish arrived. Quechí is one of them. Pocomchi is another. Achi is another one as well. Those glottonyms have a really interesting history, but the rest of them, the ones that are associated with specific municipalities, those are all of Spanish origin. Even the term Cachiquel and Quiche, the Cachiquel and the Quiche were actually a confederation of Chinamites. So the Cachiquel Confederation, was one of the most powerful political entities at the time of the Spanish conquest. It included, people that spoke at least 3-4 different languages. So speaking the so-called Cachiquel was not a requisite to be part of this confederation. So, the emblematic value of Mayan languages is arguably also a product of colonial relations, because I'm not saying that before it wasn't important, but it played out in a very different way. And it wasn't, an issue in terms of creating larger alliances with which people truly identified, especially the elites. This is another issue, the elites in Maya up until the 19th century were divided between nobles and the commoners, and then they lived in different societies. And we tend to forget that. When we think about the Maya, we tend to think of an egalitarian society, such as the one that we see today in indigenous communities, but that wasn't the case until the 19th century. So both nobles and commoners had different emblematic language practices as well. This is something that I've been writing on in the last couple of years. Code switching is also an important, discourse resource. It's also highly stigmatized today by some Maya activists, even though it is widespread and people use it all the time, just like, what they call Spanglish in the United States. It's highly stigmatized by certain teachers and certain, prescriptivist minds, but it's widely used by most, speakers of Spanish in the United States. So variation has always been, not always, but has been considered a problem by many activists and even some Marxist scholars. Severo Martinez Peláez, the famous Guatemalan historian, a Marxist scholar, famously said that pretty much every of the cultural traits that are emblematic of the Maya today were a result of colonialism, including dialectal diversification. So the fact that there are many dialects of Cachiquel, many dialects of Quiche, were a result of colonial relations, the divisions that were imposed upon the Maya by the Spanish invaders. But that's not true. We have evidence, even the oldest colonial sources do show evidence that some of these, local varieties already existed, before the Spanish conquest. Of course, at the time, they didn't have the kind of emblematic value that they have today. Again, the society was actually quite different. But this stigmatization of regional variation is still a problem, as we see when we start talking about standardization, right? So in the 20th century, the 1970s, 1980s, there was this emergence of the Maya as a single pan-ethnic group. I say pan-ethnic. Pan-ethnicity is a category used by sociologists to refer to a conglomerate of ethnic groups that is itself divided in various subgroups. So the Maya would be one of those. You have multiple, not only do you have speakers of multiple languages, but you have people who identify as coming from specific municipalities. And these municipalities actually go back hundreds, if not thousands of years. They have their own history, their own ritual calendar, their own practices, their own ritual circles. Most of them actually are actually of the same kind as those of other groups. So there's definitely a whole series of shared cultural principles and, historical contact. But at the same time, this marking of differences is also an important aspect of what it means to be not only Maya, but Mesoamerican at large. But interestingly, the term Maya was appropriated by the Maya themselves. It was taken from the hands of scholars, and it was appropriated to reference to this emerging, pan-ethnic unity. There was demanding from the state and from the various political organizations that the Maya wanted to be their own subjects. They wanted to be, in control of their own, communities, and they demanded attention from the state. With language, of course, the argument was that all Mayan languages were equally good, equally valid, equally emblematic of Maya societies. And therefore, the ways in which the Academy of Mayan Languages, for example, was structured, took that into account. There were no differences between Mayan languages, even though there were some that were spoken only by 10,000 people, now they're spoken by more than 1 million people. So these were entities that were not equal, at least in terms of the territories and the number of speakers that each of them had. Now, given the importance of local identification, the number of Mayan languages itself has always been contested. So linguists are actually pretty certain about the number of Mayan languages, and they come up with pretty specific criteria about defining what is and what isn't a Mayan language. The criterion of intelligibility that is actually highly problematic in the Maya area. And second, the criterion of grammatical differences, which is, yeah, but on the other hand, that doesn't make a difference for the Maya, Speakers of Anjobal, Acateco, they think of their languages as being one and the same. Even though, yes, you can point out the differences, but also between, varieties of the same language, you can also point out differences. So it isn't quite clear for speakers what differences constitute different languages and what differences are just dialectal. Ultimately, there's this intuition that the definition is really political. That's something that shouldn't be controversial. So in the case of, Quiche, for example, Quiche language, the Achi split from the Quiche, from the Academy of the Quiche language back in 1993. And now, more recently, the Cubulqueños of the township of Cubulco are splitting from the Achi. And they're doing the lobbying required by law, in the National Congress to get approval for their variety to be considered a separate language from Achi. There's now, a group of folks in Cunen. Cuneteco is a Quiche variety spoken, Northern Quiche. That's the classification, Northern Quiche. And they argue that it's really a separate language. And there's actually a US graduate student who argues that it is indeed a separate language. So we see again, how in the history of emerging, national languages or ethnic languages, there's always some, expert who sanctions what is and what isn't a language, at least in some cases. There are also interesting cases like Luis de Leon, who's a Cachiquel writer who wrote exclusively in Spanish. But for some Cachiquel intellectuals, this is actually problematic, even though he uses Spanish in a very Cachiquel way. He's one of the best Guatemalan writers of the 20th century. His appropriation as a Maya writer is problematic because he himself didn't call himself Maya. He called himself Indio. So he was actually disappeared by the government in 1982. He was a member of the Communist Party. So this were the political allegiances that became more problematic into the 80s as the Maya really sought to separate themselves from those on the right and on the left that claimed to be speaking on their behalf. So what was the situation, in the 1980s with Mayan languages? Where, first of all, the end of the Civil War. This is a crucial historical development. The strategic defeat of the revolutionary forces. The revolutionary left in Guatemala collapsed and has never really recovered. The signing of the peace accords entailed the signing of the accord on the rights of indigenous peoples. So this was a crucial one. And there were there were several, Maya activists, some of them with revolutionary backgrounds, who basically gave up revolutionary politics and created their own institutions, think tanks, and there were some attempts to create political parties. There was a lot of money coming from the international cooperation to implement the peace accords, and there were many jobs, and many of them involved, development of language programs to revitalize Mayan languages. So this middle class, highly politicized, also found, professional spaces that didn't exist before, and they were exclusively for the Maya, which is great. So that was definitely something that was quite innovative in Guatemala in the 90s. There was a lot of excitement, a lot of publications, a lot of really interesting, thinkers. Demetrio Cohti, for example, I remember when I was in college, we used to go and listen to his talks. We found his thinking extremely, challenging. The political left, was in crisis, even though we saw it as an opportunity for, radical change. They were really, I guess they were in crisis. The transition from being military organizations to being political organizations was not well implemented in Guatemala. So the Maya were disenchanted with the left and mistrustful of the right. The left didn't protect them. When the big massacres in the 80s occurred, many went into exile, hundreds of thousands were killed, lots of villages were razed by the army. So the guerrillas were absent. They did not protect their, grassroots, bases. And the right, of course, was always racist and was ultimately responsible for what happened in the 70s and 80s. So the Pan-Mayanism basically sought to separate itself from both the left and the right. There was a certain disenchantment with any kind of Marxist, views of Guatemalan history. And there was also a certain mistrust of, neoliberalism and its various incarnations in Latin America. There was this embrace of essentialism, a series of, features, a series of characteristics and practices that needed to be appropriated, recovered, so that the Maya would find their own way. And there was this attempt to kind of organize, especially among the Maya themselves, to find their own word, to find their own, say, call it nuestra palabra, our word, lecatzich, which che means our word, but also our language. So linguistic and culturalist demands became really important. But I argue that they were not just important per se, but they were also a useful tactical retreat, because at the time, speaking, agrarian reform, for example, or protection of indigenous territories, freedom of speech, refashioning the Guatemalan state in ways such that, for instance, traditional Maya law would also be considered, part of the Guatemalan legal system. These were seen as too revolutionary, and there were still, not many years ago, the army was killing people that had such ideas. So it was important. It was seen as a tactical retreat, and so that had implications as well. And also in terms of language, there was a clear demand to have autonomy in terms of language planning. So the Maya would be in charge of their own language, not others would actually get to tell how we should speak or organize or plan our own languages. And of course, standardization. There was a consensus that we needed to standardize. We each speak in our own way, in our community's way, but we should each have a standard that would basically be used across, communities speaking the same language. And that standardization would also allow us to demand co-officialization of Mayan languages in Guatemala. So standardization was seen as a condition for Maya language revitalization. There were pragmatic arguments. It was easier for administrative purposes. It was easier to implement a national educational system. And it was also a reasonable way to create political subdivisions in a future Maya state. It'd be easier to think about the Quiche autonomy, the Pechi autonomy, the Ixil autonomy, and so on and so forth. There were also ideological arguments. These interpretations of Maya history that I was mentioning before. There was a certain stigmatization of colonial history as being simply as a history of oppression and resistance, not a history of innovation. And that basically led to a certain purism, a certain essentialism that, for example, would not approve of, Spanish loanwords, even though they may be old, They may be, so changed semantically as to be, really, as to have almost nothing in common with their original Spanish word. There was also the argument that behind all of the Maya of Guatemala, there was a single historical identity, this Maya identity, which was central in the political and cultural discourse. And there were also visions of Maya sovereignty, not always openly expressed, but I think the sharpest thinkers always had this in the back of their minds. I'm thinking of Demetrio Corti, who always had this clarity. He always argued that the Maya should be seeking their own sovereignty, their own state. How would you implement that state? The specifics were more complicated because, after all, you find the Maya in all of Guatemala, and you find non-Maya populations in all. So, there was never also a political organization seeking to implement these Maya independence. That never existed. And therefore, since we didn't have this kind of political institution or party, that sense of political direction was absent in language revitalization projects, unlike places like Catalonia or the Basque Country. Now, of course, the successes of revitalization basically ran against, the fact that the peace accords did not fundamentally change neither Guatemalan society nor the Guatemalan state. So the fundamental inequalities and the fundamental, exclusions and racism didn't change much. Of course, there were substantial differences. A certain Maya middle class form of intellectuals and NGO workers, government officials, definitely, was suddenly, sharing the table with other, non-Maya officials. But the problem was that there was a certain the government was able to accommodate certain Maya demands. And accommodation doesn't mean, implementation of good faith. So the Academy of Mayan Languages was, of course, founded and funded by the government. Bilingual education programs were created, although the quality was not very good, still not very good. And there were a couple of token cabinet posts, the Minister of Culture, for example. In a country where half the population at least is Maya, there was only one cabinet post for the Maya. And now, not even that. The present government, the Arevalo government, which is, it's a reformist government. It was the best, that could have happened to Guatemala in the previous election. And yet, there's not a single Maya minister. So, food for thought. And of course, some Maya leaders were co-opted. Definitely. So, the various governments that came after the signing of the peace accords, Arzu, Berger, Portillo, Otto Perez, so on and so forth, all of them had, the participation of Maya intellectuals. So these were governments that were criticized because they were not only corrupt, they favored the interest of the upper classes, they were totally right-wing. There were no policies that were actually, with the exception of the Álvaro Colom government, there wasn't really much in terms of social investment. So and yet there were always certain Maya who were willing to participate and join these governments. So what this did, was in the long run was sort of weaken some of the positions or the prestige that the Maya movement or Maya politics, or essentialist politics, if you will, had in the national space. So I've already talked about some of the limitations of. So what's the situation today? As of today, like 2024, where do we stand? Well, I would say that in consequence of this, slow crisis of legitimacy at the Academy of Mayan Languages, we basically reached the bottom. At this point, the current, leaders of the Academy of Mayan Languages are, seen, as extremely corrupt, and there is really a rebellion of the local branches of the Academy of Mayan Languages. And really, the issue is the administration of state funds, the ways in which the current, junta directiva, the board of directors, actually is using the money in ways that is definitely scandalous. I think one of the issues is that they're going to be traveling to, I think, Europe for a workshop that supposedly was designed for the technical staff of the Academy of Mayan Languages. So instead of letting the technical staff, it's a board of directors, and I traveled to France with all that entails, traveling and well, so that was a big scandal, last month. And at that point, some directors of local branches, no, we can't continue like this. We need to reform the Academy of Mayan Languages. But of course, the board of directors has support in the National Congress, which basically represents the interest of the elites and certain group interests. It's what in Guatemala, Guatemalans call this the Pacto de Corruptos, the pact of the corrupt, which is nothing but, an alliance of various, powerful groups that includes wealthy businessmen, the army, former army officials, former counterinsurgency officials, and some right-wing, extreme right-wing activists, and some right-wing, pastors, and some drug lords as well. It's an interesting, set of characters. This is one of the issues. The second issue is the rise of movements seeking the recognition of regional varieties of Mayan languages that I just mentioned. It's kind of tearing this unity of the academy apart in a way. The third is the migration to the US and its consequences, which is truly massive, as I'll speak about in a minute. And then you have the emergence of digital communication, which is a really interesting process, and it basically opens the door to new ways of thinking about revitalization. So the rise of movements seeking the recognition of regional varieties of Mayan languages as languages started actually a long time ago. It goes back to the 90s. And it is a natural result of the fact that there are a lot of local identities with a very long history that want to see themselves represented separately in terms of language. So the Achi-Quiché division was the first, but the Cubilqueños are next. If you've had the chance to work with colonial documents in Mayan language, the Memorial de Sololá, it very clearly speaks about the Cubilqueños as a very separate, ethnic group with its own interest, battling both the Achi and the Quiché. The Cunetecos, they also have a very clear, very passionate, ethnic identity. And there's also conflict in that area because in the last century, many Quiché-speaking migrants from Santa Maria Chiquimula have moved into the area. So that also entails, tensions, especially over land possession, land disputes. Since land distribution is so poor in Guatemala, whatever's left of Maya communities tends to be disputed. So pretty much every single Maya municipality in Guatemala has land conflicts with its neighbors. And some have conflicts with all of the neighbors, like Todos Santos, Cuchumatan. I've argued that Todos Santos, Cuchumatan is an expanding state because it's expanding and sort of, and has disputes with all of its neighbors. It has to do with population, it has to do with resources, and it has to do with the history of these entities. The Guatemalan government always, interfered in the way land was exchanged in the highlands. A lot of it was actually appropriated by the government and given to wealthy German planters or Ladino landowners or former collaborators of Guatemalan presidents. So this is a history of dispossession of the land. It goes back, of course, to the Spanish invasion, but then again to the government of Justo Rufino Barrios from 1871, which basically created a national registry, a registro catastral, a registry of land, of the properties. And of course, it was all designed, to favor the interest of landowners, not to favor the interest of Maya communities. So, I mentioned the crisis at the Maya Academy. There's a Hazard, missing the management of institutional programs and a lot of staff turnover. This is another issue. Some of the best staff of the academy move to other jobs because the payment the pay is better. So that's really a problem. And they have certain internal laws such that the presidents get changed every 2 years. And very often, new presidents have no not only do they not have an agenda that they want to implement or an agenda beyond favoring their own, friends and their own interest, but often they don't have the kind of technical skills required to implement language policy. Then we have, of course, the migration to the US, which is affecting a radical socioeconomic change in Maya communities. I'm actually doing research on this particular topic and its implications on language. And I say this is really a welfare crisis. The quality of life in Maya communities, even though there's more money, is definitely not getting better. There is a lot of family turmoil. There's a lot of separation. There's a lot of children who grow up without their parents. So figures of authority are constantly being challenged. The situation in which there's a lot of alcoholism, even some drugs, some of the problems, the land boundary disputes that before used to be violent, but they never involved, firearms, have actually become, since, in the States, it's so easy to find firearms. So what they're doing is that, for instance, Nahuatl, Santa Catarina, Tahuacan, now they have like even rifles, even automatic guns that have been bought in the United States and then sent down to Guatemala. This is something new, and it's basically the result of this migration. People that now have a lot of money, and that they use it sometimes to purchase guns, making conflicts that are hard to solve even harder. So I call it a welfare crisis. And of course, many Maya live as undocumented migrants in the U.S. I think most of you probably know, one or two speakers of Mayan languages, whatever, in Wisconsin. I'm not sure about Wisconsin, but they're everywhere. In West, South, Central U.S., you find them everywhere. In Austin, there are certainly many, K'iche' speakers, Mam speakers, K'iche' speakers of various, varieties. And the issue, of course, is that institutions are unprepared to cater to their needs. I'm talking about schools, I'm talking about clinics, I'm talking about, neighborhood associations, churches to some extent. So there's plenty of demand for translators, for example. I'm constantly being contacted to translate for school boards or teachers, clinics, et cetera, et cetera. So there's no lack of jobs in that particular, subfield. And, also law enforcement, the justice system. There's a very high demand for translators, lawyers speaking Mayan languages, attorneys. And unfortunately, that hasn't happened yet in the United States, although awareness it's slowly, growing about this issue. And then we have, of course, the emergence of virtuality. And that is basically changing the way in which people communicate and the ways in which people use Mayan languages. There's a massive diffusion of cell phones among the highland Maya. It's not so much like desktop computers or laptops. It's mostly cell phones. And it's definitely linked to migration. Basically, there are hundreds of thousands of Maya whose way of communicating with family is through cell phones. Very long calls. People get together to play games. People do TikTok. People do Instagram. People do all the platforms that you can think of. And people are starting to use them as well for revitalization purposes. There are, K'iche', K'iche', Mam influencers whose focus is precisely on Mayan revitalization. Now, we have no time to go through that because, of course, these are emblematic uses of language. And I'll talk about an implication of this in a minute. So you have these virtual communities. So Mayan languages are becoming virtual languages in the sense that they're used by virtual communities. In some language areas, more than others. Among the Ixil, it is very often the case that people will text back and forth in Mayan languages. In K'iche', Facebook is used constantly as a platform to speak Mayan languages, and messengers, the messages are sent back and forth in K'iche' in Mayan languages, and sometimes even by criminal networks, so who communicate in K'iche'. So what we see is a really interesting appropriation of virtual spaces by speakers of Mayan languages. Some linguists have actually tried, to create, technological adaptations for virtuality. The development of keyboards, for example, to write Mayan languages, or to develop special applications that would translate, Facebook, so on and so forth, into Mayan languages. I'm not sure those are very successful. I think people find it easier to communicate to use platforms in Spanish. because most of these are young people, and young folks tend to have a pretty good knowledge of the Spanish language. And what we have is a really interesting, also the fourth, interesting aspect of this is a certain reemergence of traditional ritual and language, even among Pentecostals. So these are rituals, these are ways of speaking that are highly emblematic of indigenous communities. So folks in the United States find these practices extremely, extremely powerful once they happen to be outside their community in the United States and without a chance of going back. Because, if you happen to be an undocumented migrant from Guatemala, once you come to the US, you don't go back unless you're definitely going back. That means waiting sometimes 10, 15 years. So, yeah, whenever you have, community events, the patron saint feast, funerals, or various activities in town, literally thousands of people connect via Facebook, for example. So Nahual Stereo, which is a radio station in Nahuala that transmits, also via Facebook, is always active. And every time funerals, church inaugurations, they're always well attended. And the attendance is, of course, virtual. Most of these folks are actually in the United States. Churches, for example, are flourishing. Pentecostal churches and the Catholic Church itself. There are huge churches in Nahuatl, for example, beautiful buildings, extremely wealthy churches built with the diezmos, with the tithe of, migrants. Also, the Catholics are not lagging behind, and some of their chapels are actually quite beautiful and ostentatious. So definitely there's a competition in that regard. Commodities have become a way of competing. It's a way of kind of presenting or showing off, queuing whatever prestige you're accruing by virtue of having money. Also, there's a certain the so-called gospel of prosperity. It's never called that way by the Maya, but in Maya practice, especially in some Pentecostal churches, it's definitely there. There is some really interesting work also about the implications of borrowing and the payment of interest rates and so on and so forth. That is really, again, it's transforming communities that before, until recently, did not have this kind of practice. So what to do? Very quickly, I've already spoken 10 minutes beyond my 45 minutes. I apologize. So what to do? Well, it seems to me that we need to repoliticize Mayan languages. Maya language revitalization needs to become an element of transformational political agendas. And they should be designed in such a way such that Mayan languages do play a role. This entails, rethinking the role of Mayan languages in the political process in Guatemala and presumably Mexico, in other countries of Latin America in which indigenous languages are spoken by thousands of people. Also, in the new social scenario, we need to rethink the goals, the means, and the targets of revitalization. We have many Maya in the United States, many Maya in Guatemala. Maya who speak, languages as different from each other as Techi, Che, Pachiquel, with millions of speakers. In other languages spoken in Sipacapense, Tequiteco, by only a few thousand. So definitely we need to have plural strategies and take into account the interests and the needs of a plurality of subjects. And we need to incorporate also even the United States in this effort of revitalization. At least at the local level, at the level of schools and cities that are now having to cater to the needs of their new citizens who happen to be speakers of Mayan languages. Thank you very much for your attention. I apologize for running, beyond my allocated time.
Thanks so much, Sergio. So yeah, we have some time for questions. Feel free to open your microphone or raise your hand, whatever's easier for you. Go ahead, Kata.
Yes, so thank you so much for this lecture. I work in Yucatan, so I could relate to a lot of what you're saying about Guatemala. But what I don't know, what I wonder if you could tell us a little more about is, how does that standardized language looks like in Guatemala? What kind of debates were there when there were negotiations about spelling, about which forms to use in Yucatan? I found it very, very interesting.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that's really what I'm trying to get to. There's a lot of variation between different languages because you're talking about very different communities and very different histories. So, for example, Quiche has a lot of variation, of course, but it's not as radical as variation in Mam. So different varieties of Mam are often not mutually intelligible. So in Quiche, but the differences were actually so important that in a kind of Solomonic solution, the academy decided not to represent, vowel length, which is a phonemic category in Mayan languages. It was seen as so controversial, whether we should mark long vowels or short vowels, that they decided not to mark vowel length at all. Mm. Now, in other cases, Kekchi, for example, standardization was actually very easy because the Kekchi have a history of communicating in their own language through this process of accommodation that they call Kekchi Secomonil. So this is community Kekchi. It's really accommodation. You basically accommodate. There are a series of stereotypes of the variety you speak at home that you avoid when you talk to someone who comes from a different municipality. And they do exactly the same. So what they do is that they kind of let go of the more marked features of their own variety and kind of approximate the variety spoken in Coban, which is, I wouldn't say a cultural center, but it's really, I guess, the most important, government administrative center of the Verapaces. So once, standardization started, it was very easily accepted. So really, there's no problem. People, oh yeah, if I speak, Eastern Kekchi, I'm not gonna say quink, meaning person. I'm gonna say yink. I won't say tio tio, meaning alive. I'll say yo yo. But I'll write tio tio. It's not a problem. That doesn't mean I don't write. I mean, the differences are noticeable. People do use them strategically in discourse. But in terms of accepting a standard, it was not at all problematic. In Ixil is an interesting language because the varieties of Ixil, the varieties of Nebaj and Chahul are convergent. The variety spoken in Quetzal is quite divergent. So arguably, they're different languages. So until recently, they tried to write, standard Ixil in the same way. So that'd be approaching the Nebaj variety. But a few, administrations ago, in the Academy of the Ixil language, it was decided that each variety should write the way they talk. So they use the same alphabet, but they each write in the way they talk. So they've produced some really interesting, publications where you see, the Nebaj, Chahul, and Quetzal varieties. They're all Ixil. And when they communicate, if you happen to be from Quetzal, you speak Quetzaleño, that's fine. And then the Chajuleños and Nevajeños have to, accommodate. Of course, not everyone agrees with this. There are some speakers who are extremely, prescriptivist and who say that no, we should do the Nebaj variety because it's the one that's the most widespread, the largest municipality, and so on and so forth. But the Chajuleños say, hey, but we actually, the Ixil, no, the ancestral home of the Ixil is a little town called Ilom, which is up in the highlands. So Ilom is actually in Chahul. So they say, no, we should speak like in Ilom. And the Chajuleño and the Ilomeño are actually the same variety. So as you can see, there are some technical disagreements, but in the background, there are always these political and cultural differences. So again, to wrap up the question, what do people argue about? Well, how to represent specific vowels, how to represent specific consonants, how to represent vowel length, and what specific, how to represent, morphology. Should we do the full morphology the way it was back in the 16th century, or should we do the actual morphology people use today, in which there's a lot of deletion? So those are the arguments that people, engage in.
Suppose that even within the standardized version, it often happens that the same word is written in 3 different ways because this is still process.
Yes, or it may be that in different varieties, a certain concept will be said in different ways. There are places where, for instance, chocol in Cachiquel means, chocol means, in Patsun, it means to sitting down. But in Tecpan means to ride, like when you're riding on a horse or a motorbike, that position. So it's the same word, but it has different meanings. So there are also those emblematic differences. Okosh means mushroom in many Quiche dialects, but in Santa Maria Chiquimula, it means vagina. So over there, you need to say usheche or tuk-tuk. Tuk-tuk is Santa Maria Chiquimula, which is funny because tuk-tuk in many other places is the woodpecker. So those differences are actually and registered. They're registered. They're registered. So they're cultural registers, and people recognize them as such.
Thank you.
There's a hand, Ariel, go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Romero. Thanks for your talk. I have a number of questions, but I'll start with an easier one, perhaps, maybe not. I appreciate you talking about the number of ethno-linguistic groups or languages spoken, and just reading different articles. There's so many different numbers circulating. So I was just curious, where did the 23 come from, and sort of what's the source? What gets to be the source, right? For you.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I think the source actually goes back to the colonial period, when the first Dominicans, Franciscans, Augustinians who engage in descriptive work actually identified a number of languages based on mutual intelligibility. And then more recently in the 20th century, the work of the PLFM, led by Terence Kaufman, a very famous Mesoamericanist, historical linguist, who was quite an interesting character. He was a man of encyclopedic knowledge who had an interest in historical linguistics, reconstructing the history, reconstructing the proto-languages, proto-Maya in particular. So he developed a system to classify Mayan languages based on a number of phonological, morphological, and syntactic features. Very thorough work, very much based on very traditional historical linguistics. And this was actually crucial because back in the 70s, when his collaborators began training native speaker linguists, they basically learned the techniques and the frameworks used by linguists at the time. So this whole cadre of indigenous linguists basically implemented Terry Kaufman's project in terms of how the languages would be differentiated. This was not imposed by American linguists. They actually made a decision, the Maya themselves, to classify the languages in that way. So it wasn't only linguists, it was also writers, it was also Maya intellectuals, but linguists played a fundamental role, which is not, both American linguists and Maya linguists. In other cases, the role of linguists has been very marginal. Thinking about German, for example, playwrights played a fundamental role in encoding what we call now Hochdeutsch. In other places, it's been writers. But in the case of the Maya, it's been linguists. And that is probably of a very prescriptivist bent also, which is probably a problem. Because this kind of very technical discourse can be pretty exclusive. And since you're basing your authority on a certain knowledge that you acquire, reading books and going to workshops and colleges and so on and so forth, that's not necessarily accepted by other speakers of Mayan languages. So that's where it comes from. And then it became officialized when the Academy of Mayan Languages just decided that it was going to start with 22 Mayan languages, 22 or 21.
Okay, thank you so much.
Other questions?
Well, I can ask one more question. In Yucatan, there is a lot of struggle about considering Yucatec Maya to be a second official language of Yucatan. I suppose that there has been some conversation about that in Guatemala, but having 22 Mayan languages must be a obstacle in pursuing that route. Could you tell us a little more about, what has been said, what has been debated about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, this is an idea that has been circulating among activists and Maya linguists for quite a few years. Back in the 80s, it was suggested that maybe Quiche should be the language that all Maya learn to communicate. Why? Well, because of the number of speakers and because of the Popol Vuh, the Maya Bible. So it was a good reason to think of Quiche as being the language that would bind everyone together. And more recently, a few weeks ago, a very famous Cachiquel writer, actually, a young writer, he's in his 20s, actually suggested that they should think about, choosing a Mayan language so that they could basically wean themselves of Spanish. So the question is, what specific language? Yeah, I think it's either Quiche or Cachiquel. And these proposals have always come from Cachiquel and Quiche speakers, interestingly. I think that has to do also with the fact that speakers of other languages, they're actually more familiar with a second or third Mayan language. So that maybe leads to a different kind of attitude, a different sort of, for the Ixil and the Quiche speakers in Ixil country, speaking 2-3 languages is normal. So yeah, it's a good question. It has different sides to it. Yeah.
I wanted to ask a question before time's up, Sergio, about when you mentioned that kind of disenchantment with the leadership in the Academia de Lenguas Mayas. And I kind of just wanted to get your perspective in working with people when they are writing in whatever language they speak. Are they kind of trying to just separate themselves, not only like forming independent linguistic communities, but just in the practice of writing in general, like this disenchantment with prescriptivism and what's coming out of the academia? Do you note that people, when they write, maybe just any type of writing, are they just sort of trying to reflect the way they speak more and ignoring the standard, or not?
That's a great question. I have to say that, many years have elapsed. And I think the Academy of Mayan Languages has gained a legitimacy that it didn't have in the beginning. And, standardization is a fact. It wasn't a fact before, but now it's been somewhat accepted. So the way some communities react to it is by saying, no, we want to create our own standard. They're not saying, it's a bad idea to standardize. No, they want their own standard. So definitely, there's been a certain legitimation in all these years. So I've criticized some of the leaders of the academy, but a lot of good work has been done as well. And at the local level, at the local branches, they have some excellent technicians. They call them técnicos linguistas. So they're hired as specialists, and they often work for many years in a specific branch. And very often they have a tremendous knowledge of the language. They're very committed. They write very well, and they do, organize workshops to train people so that they can read and write their own languages. I'm familiar with the work of the Ixil Academy, for example. They're extremely active, not only language, but also cultural activists. I'm also familiar with the Cachiquel Academy. I mean, they're fantastic. These are fantastic intellectuals, very committed, and they speak beautiful Cachiquel. They're very young, much younger than me, but they're excellent. So I do see a lot of great things happening. And I think what's happening now, this whole process of disenchantment, maybe that was the wrong word, but I think it has to do because with the fact that it's also an institution that's gained some level of legitimacy, and people think it's very sad that it's being used, as if it were another of the government's corrupt institutions. I think it's supposed to live, to higher standards, and this is what explains this sort of. But at the same time, it's not indifference. People are angry about this, and they're organizing. They're trying to do something about it. Although it's hard to do because the current board of directors has the support of people in Congress. So finding a way to actually make a change is a bit complicated.
I think with that, if there aren't any more questions, we can end the session. That was great. Thank you so much for sharing all your work with us. And I'm sure if you have any additional questions, you can feel free to email Sergio. I'm sure he'd be happy to answer.
Absolutely. I had a great time. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Matios.